Americanist Perspective with Tom Edlem and Sherilyn Stanley. An expose of the people and powers shaping world events not covered by the major media. An Americanist Perspective is brought to you by the Fox Cities chapters of the John Birch Society in the pursuit of less government, more responsibility, and, with God's help, a better world.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of An Americanist Perspective. Sherilyn Stanley's off tonight, but we are privileged to have a very special guest, Mr. Don Fotheringham, who is the spokesman for constitutional issues for the John Birch Society. Welcome, Don.
Pleased to be here, Tom.
Well, thank you. We'll be talking about term limits today. Term limits are not something we ordinarily think of as constitutional issues, and for the moment I'd like to not discuss it as a constitutional issue per se, but the issue on its merits. Don, I'm Tom. What is wrong with term limits? Because I know the John Birch Society opposes term limits.
Term limits is a bad idea. Not only does the John Birch Society oppose term limits, Alexander Hamilton does, Madison does, George Washington opposed term limits. The great founders of our nation opposed term limits because it destroys accountability. If a person can only serve for a limited period of time and he's prone to abuse, he's going to do the abuse early in the term. And in fact, they even used the expression in the, I believe it was in the Federalist Papers, to make hay while the sun shines. If a person knows, if a public official knows that he's going to have to face those voters again and account for his conduct during the previous 2 years or 4 years, whatever the term is, he's much more apt to abide by the will of the electorate and to stick by the limitations of his office.
That's sort of the opposite of what we hear from term limit organizations. Ordinarily what we hear is they have to go back to the ranks of citizenship, and what we really need is I guess you could call it perpetual lame duck Congress. Aren't these lame duck sessions of legislatures usually more frugal with the taxpayer money and such?
Well, the promoters, the advocates of term limits, don't use the lame duck expression. That's our expression. A lame duck legislature is historically and traditionally the most notoriously irresponsible. The members of the House or Senate who are serving during that little period of time between November and Inauguration Day tend to pass a lot of things that they normally would not pass. And an example of the Federal Reserve Act is an example of that. Here you have something that has, as years have gone by, has proved to be a very difficult thing to work with, a very bad piece of legislation, and yet it's still in place and was passed by a lame duck session. The big point with regard to term limits is that when an official wants to be reelected and wants a good reputation, a good track record, then that is a result of his looking ahead, looking to the future to serve.
And as opposed to someone, if they're leaving office, they might look to pad themselves a cushion or make a few friends so they can get a job in the private sector. If they can win a contract for a friend or a party member, maybe they could land some soft job after the office.
There is that possibility, that likelihood. Term limits are promoted as an idea to bring about responsibility and to break the close ties with lobbyists that particularly members of Congress are supposed to have. But an interesting aspect on that occurred a few years ago when one of the universities polled the staffs of members of the U.S. House and Senate. And the question they asked them was, what influences your boss the most? And I believe there are some 20 questions. And number 19 on the list was lobbyists. So at least according to the staff members, lobbyists are the least, have the least influence.
What was number
on
one?
their bosses. Number one was personal phone calls from constituents. Number two was personal letters, spontaneously written letters from constituents. They both came ahead of the editorial in the local paper, in the hometown paper. So
Very interesting.
It was a very interesting survey and a very interesting thing.
And all right, we've talked about how term limits would actually decrease a representative's reaction to the voters, but isn't that what we want? An independent citizen legislature that goes in for a time and serves their public service and is not beholden to any particular public interest, that they serve the public interest, not the passions of the public. That's the other argument of the term limit side. It's sort of the elitist argument of the term limit side, I guess you would say.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Actually, the accountability is with the electorate. And it's ironic that people complain that congressmen serve year after year and they become very entrenched and implacable, and yet they go back to the polls and vote for them every time. Otherwise, they're not re-elected incumbents.
It's almost as if every 2 years we have a poll on term limits and the voters vote against it.
That is precisely right. What people want is limited government, not limited terms. But the term limit advocates have come up with a very ingenious slogan saying to people, look, if you want limits and if you want a responsible Congress, let's hold those guys down, let's limit their terms. And what they don't realize what they're saying, or maybe they realize what they're saying, but what it really amounts to is they're saying, let's get people in government who don't know what they're doing, who don't have the experience, and who don't recognize a shrewd lobbyist when they see one. A principled senior legislator won't listen to most lobbyists because they know their techniques, their strategies, they know what they want in exchange, and they're not willing to make those compromises. So there's a lot of baloney being circulated about term limits. Let me just give you an example. In Nevada, we have out there a bill that comes up every year for refunding education. It's an extremely complicated bill. And the legislative members of especially in the finance committees, have to serve 2 or 3 terms before they fully comprehend it. The novices come in, the newly elected freshmen come in, and they vote for these appropriations, one after the other. And the old timers have to get them up and say, hey, wait just a minute. This is not what it looks like. And these people have learned how to write their needs and their demands in such a way that they're couching millions of dollars over here.
Right.
And it takes a great deal of experience to spot these things and pick them up.
I've noticed that in federal legislation, having to deal with that from the research end at the John Birch Society.
Government is a very complicated thing. You don't learn it in a minute. And I'm not saying that there are not those who learn to abuse when they're there for a longer period of time, but it's absolutely essential that the time be allowed for those who are not prone to abuse to learn their jobs and to do their jobs well.
It's sort of the argument with term limits, you would get rid of Ted Kennedy, but you'd get rid of some of the principled people in Washington D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And if the voters in Massachusetts, I come from Massachusetts originally, are dumb enough to keep re-electing Ted Kennedy, they're probably dumb enough to elect someone equally injurious to their interest if he were forced out of office.
Well, I appreciate that very much. In other words, you're confessing that you would elect someone just as bad. Is that right, Tom?
Not me. Not anymore. I moved out of Massachusetts. I guess there's a little slogan. Every great tyranny has the refugees that flee from their borders. In Berlin, they have the feet people that walked across the border before they built the wall, and then they have the boat people in Vietnam, and New Hampshire has the station wagon people who come up from Massachusetts.
Well, you've made your point very well. It's a good point. And the point is this. People are going to re-elect the same kinds of people. You're not going to change policy with term limits. And if you don't like foreign policy, you don't like domestic policy or financial policy of the United States or the way our things are being handled, You don't change that by limiting terms. You change that by unelecting the people who have programs you don't approve of, and you throw them out at the ballot box. The ballot box is really the only thing that they fear.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, before the show we discussed a little bit about the Founding Fathers and how and during the show you mentioned how they were opposed to term limits.
Very definitely.
Let's talk about their personal history. There's the impression that all of the Founding Fathers were sort of citizen representatives that did a short period of service in the federal government, and like George Washington, after the 2 terms, he said, "That's it, I'm going back to Mount Vernon."
Well, unfortunately, there is an organization in this country based in Washington, D.C., has a lot of money. It's called U.S. Term Limits. They are propounding that falsehood. They're making people believe that our Founding Fathers established a novice citizen legislature, and that a great tragedy has occurred in the United States, that we now, instead of having citizen legislators, we have a permanent, professional, self-perpetuating body of people there who have a lock hold on government. This is preposterous. In the first place, our Founding Fathers were the most seasoned, most experienced statesmen on the face of the earth. Nearly every member of the Constitutional Convention, those who were delegates to the Constitutional Convention, had served in the national legislature under the Articles of Confederation, and many of them were serving under there even while they were convened in Philadelphia. They had served as governors of their states, as legislators, as members of their state legislature, and in many offices under the Crown. These men knew what they were doing. They went in there not only with a tremendous amount of practical experience, but they had done their homework. They understood their history. They knew why Roman civilizations failed. They knew why the biblical civilizations failed. And they knew what principles to apply to bring about a government strong enough to protect the lives, liberties, and property of the people, but not so strong as to enslave them. And this is the foundation that we have. We didn't have a bunch of novices off the farm with hay seeds in their vest, coming in there trying to figure out what they're going to do tomorrow. That is a bunch of baloney. That is falsely propagated by U.S. term limits, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
So what you're saying is, if you go over the personal lives of the founders, you find that James Madison served in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. He went to the Congress, or the Constitutional Convention. He went from there to service in the House of Representatives for 10 years, and then he became Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, and then two terms as president for himself, and that's basically his career.
And in fact, just for the fun of it, one time I added up Madison's and George Washington's and Benjamin Franklin's. It came to over 80 years of public service just between the three of them. And I didn't put in Hamilton because he got himself in trouble and got himself shot in a duel, so he didn't serve too long, but he would have.
Sure.
That was their principle, was just to bring permanency and confidence to government. The big problem they had under the Articles of Confederation is the foreign policy was a shambles because they had no confidence abroad. They were fighting in between themselves, in between the states, and there was constant turnover. Under the Articles of Confederation, they had one-year terms. That is real term limits for you. And so this constant rotation in the Articles of Confederation. All who went to the convention knew it was a mess. And whatever they did, the one thing they were not going to do was have term limits.
Well, that's interesting that they had term limits under the Articles of Confederation, and in the new Constitution, the one we have right now, that they set up in 1787, they abolished term limits.
They abolished it promptly, yes.
I think most people aren't aware of that.
No, they're not aware of that. Now, it wasn't as simple and as cut and dried as that, because they were appointees, but they were appointed. There was only one body. It was a unicameral system under the Articles of Confederation, and they were appointed by the legislatures of their states. They received one-year appointments. Very often they would renew them, more often than not, but at least it gave them the opportunity to say, okay, you really messed things up. You've been there for a year. Come on out. We're going to send in George Johnson, and he's going to serve for a year, and we'll see how he does.
Great.
So they did have that option.
We're going to talk a little bit more about term limits and some of the new ways that have been proposed to implement term limits that may not actually implement term limits. If you're confused, tune in. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking about term limits, and we've just finished talking about how the Founding Fathers were very much opposed to term limits, that they had abolished it from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. And as a sort of way of segueing into the new way term limits are being promoted, or I should say the cause of term limits is being used, you mentioned earlier, Don, the U.S. term limits trying to give the impression that the Founding Fathers were supportive of term limits by citing, for instance, John Adams. Actually, the quote that they had used was something akin to, "I support annual elections. That's where freedom begins and ends." But Adams actually is on record as opposing term limits. He just liked regular, frequent elections.
Yeah, they managed to dig up a few big names and attach to them a few quotations taken totally out of context. They've been very dishonest. Perhaps the most dishonest thing that U.S. term limits has done is promoting at the ballot box in state initiatives. They have promoted what they call term limits, which actually calls for a constitutional convention. And to me, that's the most deceitful thing that has taken place in recent years in our country.
Let's talk about, I think some of our viewers may be unclear. What is a constitutional convention?
Okay,
can you explain that to us?
A constitutional convention is what you might call the peaceful revolution. It is a deliberative body that brings about and establishes a government under a free society. That's what took place in 1787. The states appointed delegates by legislation and authorized them to meet in one place to make substantial changes in the form of government, which at that time, their constitution, and then, of course, was the Articles of Confederation. But that's what a constitutional convention is. It is the coming together of individuals, delegates, who are authorized to speak for their states and to draft a new form of government or to make extensive changes in the government as it exists and the structure of the government. We're talking about structural organic law, not statutory things. We're talking about basic fundamental things.
Changing the Constitution or wiping it out completely?
Changing it, wiping it out. As I'm sure everyone realizes, in the Declaration of Independence, there is that ongoing reservation that when people become dissatisfied with their form of government or suffer abuses, it is not only their right but their duty to form a new government. And a constitutional convention is the peaceful process for bringing that about.
Okay, and that actually is enshrined in our Constitution, the current Constitution. There's a process by which we get to that.
Our Constitution, under Article 5 of our Constitution, provides two ways to amend the Constitution. One is not by a constitutional convention. One is within the framework of the Constitution itself, and that's through Congress. Whenever 2/3 of both houses of Congress elect to propose an amendment, they can make the proposal, send it out to the states, and when it's ratified by 3/4 of the states, then it becomes a part of the Constitution. The second route is for the states themselves to call a convention rather than having Congress handle it. In this case, when 2/3 of the states call a convention, Congress is obliged to bring one together, and from that time on, the states appoint their delegates and conduct their business, which is the business of a sovereign society.
Okay, now we've got 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the most recent being in 1992. How many of those amendments have been adopted via the Congress route, and how many by the Constitutional Convention route?
I'm so glad you asked that, and I'm glad you asked it in that way. Tom, none of them have ever been accomplished or brought about through the Constitutional Convention process. The process has never been used. The reason the process has never been used is no one has ever figured out how to control it. When you have a free people in a free society who determine their own destiny and their own structure, they have sovereign powers.
So what you're saying is if there's any precedent, I guess you'd go back to the 1787 convention, where they were instructed to recommend changes to the Articles of Confederation, and what they did was they threw out the Articles of Confederation, wrote up a new constitution, and then wrote up new rules on how this constitution would be adopted, because under the Articles of Confederation it had to be unanimous for any changes to be made, and they changed those rules in 1787, did they not?
That's a mouthful. That's right. That's right. What they did, they exceeded their mandate. As you've indicated, they were sent to Philadelphia to work out some border and trade problems, and they ended up solving most of our other problems, some of them by great vision and foresight, and we're glad they did. We're grateful for what occurred in 1787. They were wise men, they were very inspired men, they knew what they were doing, and they established what has been the marvel of the world as far as a guide, a structure for the operation of a free civilization. U.S. Constitution is quite remarkable. But I'm not sure we want to do that again. I don't think we have enough Hamiltons and Washingtons and Madisons to handle that today.
Yeah, but we've got Clinton and Gingrich and Kennedy.
We really don't want a convention, do we? Anyway, U.S. term limits has actually insinuated that into these petitions that they're circulating in the initiative stage. Now,
okay, I wanted to get back to that.
Yeah, okay.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, Wisconsin is not an initiative state, and so it might take a little bit more explanation. In 23 of our states, the people, anyone with the ambition to do so, can get a sufficient number of signatures to get a measure on the ballot at a general election time. And in the states which allow that have the initiative process, U.S. term limits has gone in, and they have hired petitioners to circulate these long 4-page, legal-sized, complicated petitions that nobody in the world can ever read, and nobody has ever read, really. Nobody has ever sat down. If they did,
I bet you sat down and read it.
I did read it, but I didn't sign it. Buried in those petitions is not only all of this verbiage about penalties for candidates who don't support term limits one way or another, have their name printed on the ballot and beside their name, violated voter instructions respecting term limits and so forth. But buried in there is the command for the legislature of that state to call an Article 5 convention for the purpose of proposing term limits.
So what you're saying is that these term limit petitions that go on the ballot in other states, what they say is if a state representative does not vote for a constitutional convention, which may or may not propose term limits, then he will have on his ballot at the next election some sort of a scarlet letter saying disregarded voter instructions on term limits.
He'll be punished. He'll be punished on the ballot. Now, people didn't know what they were signing. The petitioners, who were paid petitioners, they were getting 70 cents to $1 a signature, making a couple $100 a day, rushing as fast as they can in the crowded places. Hey, how'd you like to limit Congress terms? This is to limit terms. Sign here. Oh, yeah, where can I sign? That's a good idea. And people were signing as fast as they could sign. They didn't have the foggiest notion that they were putting on the ballot a mandate for their state legislature to get the nation into deep constitutional waters with a constitutional convention. And that is totally dishonest. It's fraud. There have been a few fraud suits on that basis.
So some people who actually signed the petition have gone back and read it and said, hey, wait a minute, I didn't...
They've gone and complained to the Secretary of State and said, well, hey, wait just a minute. I was assured that all this was just the legalese necessary to limit terms. I had no idea that I was calling for a constitutional convention. With those, they had the measure on ballots in 13 states this last November. With those revelations, we were able to kill the measure at the ballot box in 5 of those states. North Dakota, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming.
That's kind of unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, especially since they were passing state term limits by leaps and bounds. 70 and 80% popularity for the issue.
I think it was, wasn't it U.S. term limits bragging before the '96 election that no state had ever rejected?
Yeah, no state ever rejected. They didn't expect any to. Well, it came as quite a shock to U.S. term limits to find that the people had been alerted, and we can credit, especially at least in 4 of those 5 states for sure, the efforts of members of the John Birch Society to bring to light the fact that those petitions were misrepresented, that the CONCOM was induced by fraud, the Constitutional Convention was induced by fraud, and the people were alerted early enough to vote them down. In some of those the other states, like Idaho, where there was a great deal of awareness, U.S. term limits comes in with a I'm not going to say how many million, but it was a big, big media campaign because the governor had wised up, the legislature had wised up, they were issuing official statements to the effect that this is a call for a constitutional convention, it has nothing to do with limiting terms, and so U.S. term limits dumped all their money into media there, and they just barely squeaked it through with 1 or 2% of the vote.
So you mean that multi-million-dollar John Birch Society counter campaign didn't have that in fact?
With all the money the John Birch Society has, we should have beaten that one.
I joke about that because we probably didn't put 2 cents into it.
We're the most grassroots people on the face of the earth.
Sure. I think we've got to wrap it up here. But let's just, can you, in your final statement here, just give us an outlook of what's ahead for term limits in 98 and 2000.
Yeah.
What are their plans?
Okay, what they're doing here in the state of Wisconsin, they're going around to the cities and counties, trying to get the cities and counties and the dog catcher and the coroner, every official, to opt to limit his terms, which is, it may work 1 or 2 terms at a time, but pretty soon they're going to run out of people, especially in these small areas. They're going to run out of qualified people. But the idea of them doing this is once they get your county commissioners term limited, then they ask the commissioners to petition the legislature to bring about term limits, or even worse, to bring about the initiative process. And I'd like to say to the citizens here in Wisconsin, don't go for the initiative process. You'll be sorry if you do. It'll not only mess up your ballot, but it'll give sharpshooters an opportunity to mess with your liberties and your freedoms.